Yep. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining the webinar today. It's right up 10 o'clock here Central Time. We will start in just another minute or two. We'll give people a chance to join in. So we'll start in just a minute or two. Thanks. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Thank you, everyone, for joining today. This is our webinar on the state of enterprise mobile security. It's a review of the report findings. We're doing this in 2020, so you can see the year 2020. It looks at the data that we've compiled over all of 2019. My name is Michael Callahan. I am our Chief Marketing Officer here at Zimperium. If you have questions as you go through this, there is a little menu choice on your screen where you should see it says Q&A. Just enter your question there. I'll look at it throughout the session and then answer, and then we will get this out to everyone. The report actually out to everyone after the webinar. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. A little bit of background on the report. This contains it's looking at over 45 million endpoints. It's completely anonymized, but endpoints that across all of our customers from various sizes, all enterprise organizations, but various sizes. And it looks at risks and threats. And we've grouped these into these two categories of, and it's important to remember this as we go through it, but threats and attacks. So threats are things that are, as you would imagine, and kind of by definition, it's a threat to an organization, or it increases the likelihood of something being attacked. Attacks, on the other hand, are actual attacks that have occurred or were in process of being occurred and and we stop them. In general, though, what this report answers is a question that we get multiple times a day, and from just about everyone that we speak with about mobile security. And really, I mean, again, there's multiple questions that people ask, but it really all boils down to how many and how are my mobile endpoints being attacked. People want to know, if I have 5,000-6,000 people in my organization, or I have even more than that, how many are under attack? And how are they being attacked? What's the mechanism that the attackers are using to attack these devices? And a key point to remember there, and you end up getting into a bit of a circular discussion about how many of my endpoints are being attacked, is we'll often have the discussion with people that aren't using a mobile threat defense solution. They'll say, well, but I'm not being attacked, or I'm not under attack, or my mobile devices are secure. And where the circular discussion comes at that is we will say, well, how do you know? And they'll say, well, we know that we haven't seen any breaches, but it's impossible to know if a device is being attacked if there's nothing on the device that's picking up an attack or stopping an attack. And so that's where you get into that sort of circular discussion. A way that we tend to think about it, and maybe this is helpful for all of you as you're talking internally with your peers, is you think of the device as an endpoint. If you think of the mobile device as an endpoint, just like you do a laptop or a desktop, you tend to get away from arguments that I mentioned earlier, and you get into discussions like, would you ever think of not putting some kind of protection on a laptop or protection on a desktop, knowing that mobile devices, tablets or phones, have access to or contain the exact same information. In fact, most people tell us that they do. You can do 70-80% of your work every day on your phone, not even touching, your laptop or desktop. You may come up with your own numbers as you think about that statistic, but thinking about it as an endpoint is a key part of making sure that you're providing protection for your organization. So with that, the setup and a little bit about the report, let's keep going. So as I mentioned, we're going to do threats and attacks, those two categories, and we'll go through each area. So we have device, network, and applications. So device, network, applications, easy to remember at DNA, and each one has threats and attacks. And so we'll show the highlights of each of these areas by threats and attacks. So the first one is threats. So what you see here is a threats to an organization. Again, this is not an attack simply because you have vulnerabilities, but it definitely increases the threat or the risk level to your organization. So in 2019, and this may be surprising to you, we tend to see these released not in one big batch, but over time. But in 2019, the mobile OS vendors released over 1,000 patches for security vulnerabilities. In fact, Apple had over 300, and 64% of those were considered critical, which I think is pretty telling. That of all of those vulnerabilities, you had over half, almost 2/3, that are deemed critical. And again, it goes to, well, so why is this happening? The reason it's happening is because the attackers are finding that it's a path of least resistance. If you go through the phone to the exact same information you might have on a desktop or laptop, it's way easier because these vulnerabilities are out there and they're being exploited. In fact, some of you may have seen some of the recent statistics or what people are paying for 0 days across all kinds of operating systems, from traditional like Windows or even Mac OS to the mobile ones, mobile operating systems, and it's $1 million or higher. And you step out of like what you're doing every day for a second and think about why that is. Why would someone pay for $1 million to exploit a vulnerability? The reason is they're going to make up more than that in return. So there's something incredibly valuable on the phones, either on it or what it has access to, that people see, and they're willing to invest or pay $1 million plus for access to something that exploits some of those vulnerabilities. So you can see that the vulnerabilities continue to increase. For Apple, there was 300. For Google, they patched over 850 of them. Google for the Android operating system had about 12% that were deemed critical, but overall they had a factor more than what Apple had, but still 1,000 between the two of them. And it says it's a target, right? If it wasn't a target and people weren't exploiting these vulnerabilities or discovering the vulnerabilities, you wouldn't have nearly this amount. And this is quite a significant increase from 2018 to 2019, having over 1,000 in 2019. Related to this is, you see, so you have these vulnerabilities in the operating systems, and then you look at, well, how often or how frequently are people updating the operating system? Because if they're updating, then they're getting these patches included. So you would think, well, maybe everybody is, as soon as that comes out, you get that notice from Apple or Google, and it says, there's a new operating system. People do it immediately. Well, the reality is that's not the case. So if you look at the end of 2019, almost half of the iOS devices were more than 4 versions behind the current one. And so you can see kind of the distribution here. So despite the fact that there is a patch available, many people aren't applying that patch through an operating system update. And so it continues to put the organization at risk. In fact, what's interesting sometimes is if you go through the update that's available, and I do this every time, but on the most recent one, a 13.3 from Apple, went through, and if you click through some of the notes, when it'll say, like, here's the security information related to this patch, because it's not always security things that they're patching with the update. It's also features or functionality, maybe bugs, whatever. You can click through to the security side. On that particular one, on the latest one from Apple, there were 25 security related CVEs that were addressed with that update. pretty significant number, right? In just one patch. I have seen that as high as 60. There was one, some mid last year, I can't remember the exact version number, but it was up to 60, which is pretty incredible. And it says, people are discovering the vulnerabilities, they're trying to exploit them, and the companies are responding to that. But even if they respond with a patch, you can see that people aren't always on the most current. Same kind of situation for Android. So here's a description of Android, and almost 60% were more than 2 versions behind on Android. So this isn't an issue that is specific to Android or iOS. It's across both of the primary mobile platforms. And remember, part of the difference, so keep thinking of this device as an endpoint. It has access to or contains same information that a laptop or desktop does. But a key difference is you as the user, and you guys that are maybe listening to this that have to manage the users, those users are the admin. So unlike a laptop or a desktop where the admin can force an update or force a patch, on the mobile device, that's not always the case. Now there are tools available, like people will use UEMs or MDMs to apply patches or have the user do an update. But in general, excuse me, the user's the admin, and they can do what they want. They can update it or not, and that's why you see that distribution of older operating systems, sometimes 2, 3, 4 versions behind. So a key finding in this area is 24%, about a quarter of the enterprise mobile endpoints were exposed to device threats that didn't include the outdated operating system, right? We just talked about the operating systems and the CVEs related, but this is for device threats that were not part of that. So now let's move to device attacks. Remember, as I'm going through this, we said that we've got device, network, and application, and each one has threats and attacks. So this now we'll look at some of the actual attacks that were stopped that we saw being stopped. And here's a device. The overall device attacks in 2019. You had 57% that there was an attempt to do some sort of system or app tampering, attempt to root devices, or devices actually were rooted, or elevation of privileges where you get into some of the more advanced privileges or more advanced actions you can take on a device. Pretty high though. So 57% just on the system tampering piece, pretty significant. So remember, this is not just hey, there's a vulnerability out there. This is actual attacks that we saw on the devices themselves. A little more on that in that area. Malicious profiles are very dangerous, and there's profiles can sometimes be considered like apps on iOS, if you will. If you know what profiles are, you know that they're similar in concept to iOS, and oftentimes they're not legitimate profiles, right? Sometimes you have to install them for a variety of reasons. Maybe it's a VPN, who knows? But they do that, but then they also do something else in the background. So it's similar to an app that you might download. It says, oh, this is a flashlight app. In reality, you've downloaded something malicious, and it does some kind of exploit or vulnerability. Same thing on profiles. The profiles are specific to iOS. It's worth checking, and you can kind of read the screen as I'm talking about this, but it's worth checking to see what you have on there. Sometimes you'd be surprised at the profiles you have on your own device, and you may not even know. You'll go into settings on iPhones, and you can find your way through to the profiles. I know, as an example, I was doing some international travel a few months back and downloaded a profile that let me do VPN, or let me do Wi-Fi calling, right? So that I didn't have to pay for international fees. And I downloaded it, and it was something that was used global. And that one action by me downloaded, it was 20 or 22 profiles from various, to connect to various Wi-Fis around the world. And they weren't all, fortunately, none of them were malicious, but some of them weren't completely secure, right? I had some with outdated certificates, a couple of other things. And so it's worth looking at it. And, and I'm running Zips on my device. And so, it flagged them and said, hey, you may want to take a look at this. So it's important to look at it. You might be surprised. Go into settings, see what profiles you have loaded. Here's an example. So on these profiles, what we saw across this sample, right, of 45 million endpoints, almost 70% were considered high risk of the profiles that we saw, and then 20% medium and only 12% low. So it's important because it is a mechanism that attackers will use to gain control of an iOS-based device. They'll do it through some sort of malicious profile. So now we'll move from device. Remember I said there's device, network, and apps. Now we're looking at network threats and attacks. And just a reminder, if you have questions as I'm going through this, put it in the Q&A box. So network threats. So overall, we detected over 3 million risky networks, and we use it's part of our technology. It's proprietary how we identify risky networks, but it's incredibly accurate, and we saw last year over 3 million, and it's almost impossible. Like, it's almost hard to comprehend 3 million risky networks, and this isn't like the same one over and over again. This is 3 million different networks that phones attempted to connect to that were risky for one reason or another. And it's important to be able to stop that kind, or at least warn the user that that's happening, because it is a way that someone will gain control of the device. So you can see here's a kind of a little bit of some statistics on what kind of networks they were. So some were unencrypted, some were captive portals, handoffs, reconnaissance scans, and you know that, again, these are threats, right? These aren't attacks; these are threats. A lot of us experience captive portals if we're traveling. You might get to an airline or a hotel, and it may be it's a threat because of the way that's implemented. It's also a way that a bad person or an attacker may try to get onto your devices using something very similar to captive portal. But I'd call off this one about this reconnaissance scan. I mean, I assume that most people on this call have been in security, like I have for a while, and in the traditional world of the traditional endpoints like laptops, desktops, that scans how you start it all, right? That's the first step in the the attack chain or the kill chain is you do some kind of reconnaissance, and so you're scanning it to see, what do I have? What operating system? Is it vulnerable? Is it not? What apps are on it? Where's it connecting? Whatever the reconnaissance might be, that's how you start the whole process. And we pick up quite a bit of that, right? And so 10% of the time, we're seeing these reconnaissance scans, which is the very first step in attack. And so if that's happening, it's not by accident. It's intentional, and it shows you that these devices are under attack. People are looking at them because they contain or they have access to the same same information that you have on a laptop or a desktop. A little bit more breakdown, more of a visual of some of the prior data, but you can see a lot of this was unsecured, captive portal, but that reconnaissance piece pretty significant. Now we'll go from network threats to network attacks. So of all the attacks, network accounted for over 90%. And so if you think about why that's so high, that is the way that you're going to get to a device. And I'll talk about apps in a little bit after we do the network piece. But in general, on the enterprise side, right, when you're trying to attack an enterprise, this isn't trying to attack a consumer or get some type of consumer information, whatever. This is enterprise. If you're an attacker and you're trying to break into an enterprise organization, you are most likely going to start with some sort of network attack. And fortunately, because of the technology we have, we stop it right there. So everything else that comes after that you're connected to a bad Wi-Fi or some sort of bad network, we stop the whole rest of the attack process there, which is why you see such a high number. But remember, it does all start with that. And 20% of the mobile endpoints experience some sort of network-based attack. You can see what kind are they? Well, man in the middle is a big one. That is something that it's very you see it often. You see it as one of the most frequent, and it is arguably one of the easier attacks to do based on how phones attached to networks. Sometimes they do it automatically. You've probably seen that. You may or may not have it set up to do that, but you can see that it will, when you get to your local coffee shop or hotel or whatever, just automatically connects. Pretty easy to set up a man-in-the-middle attack on that by spoofing or setting up a Wi-Fi that has the same name as your local coffee shop or hotel. In particular, you go to hotels that maybe executives stay at, and you set it up, and pretty easy to get that phone to connect to it, and then you execute a man-in-the-middle. But that's a pretty significant one, man-in-the-middle. So now let's move. We're going to move to apps. Again, we've done device, network, now apps, and I would just remind everyone, if you have questions, put them in the Q&A, and I'm happy to answer those as we're going along or at the end, if it makes more sense. So on app threats, almost half the Android devices had some sort of side-loaded app versus 3% of iOS. This is not surprising, given the mechanism that that Apple uses versus what Google uses in the app stores, right? So Apple has a very controlled environment, and so side-loading an app, you got to go through some gymnastics to get apps side-loaded on that. Now, Google, on the other hand, is a little bit different, and you don't have to get everything through the Play Store. And Google's done a great job here, by the way, in the Play Store. In fact, we're one of a couple of key technologies that Google is using to scan apps before they go in the App Store to address any sort of malware before it even gets to play. But nonetheless, quite a few side-loaded apps, which they may be legitimate, but often not. And if you're an attacker, that's a good way to get an app on someone's device that may or may not be legitimate. But specifically, if you're an attacker, you're going to go to maybe outside of the App Store because we're doing some good scanning up front before they get in there. You're going to go to a third party, maybe sideload some of the apps on the device. And when we analyzed the various iOS and Android apps that we see across those 45 million endpoints, most of the iOS apps and a large number of the Android apps fail to receive passing privacy grades. And this is really important because what's happening, you can almost think like, in fact, I'm talking about a phone being just like an endpoint. There is a story you can tell or an argument you can make that apps are the new endpoint, and that's where the attackers are going to take private information. And if these apps are not protecting that information, it's easier for the attacker to get access to it, or any sort of like ancillary information that happens to be related to that app. Like it could be, you may or may not consider privacy or location as a privacy thing, maybe you do, but it could be location, it could be phone numbers, it could be whatever it happens to be stored in that app. It's pretty important, and most of the apps fail in this area around privacy. We have a really great technology. It's called Z3A. It takes a look at the apps and grades them on both privacy and security risks. We've done a couple reports on these two standalone reports. If you go to the website, you can see some of the reports on that too, for travel apps, banking apps, et cetera, and the various privacy or security scores. And if you look at, so there's key finding that most critical security risks in apps, I talked about privacy in the prior one. This is security. So 70% of iOS and almost about the same for Android failed to receive the passing security grade. And there's a bunch of things we look at on the security side, but they failed to receive it. Some of the most critical, though, and those are the ability to install unapproved code or functionality, or execute some sort of injected code. Let me go a little bit more into the apps now. So we did app threats, now app attacks. What we found is about 5% of all the attacks were app attacks, kind of 5%. But and I mentioned this before, but as you can read it in writing here, is based on the fact that we are on device doing the detection, and a lot of those, even those app-based attacks, come from originate from being connected to a bad Wi-Fi or a bad network. We stop a lot of that attack or that kill chain early on in the kill chain. So you may not ever get to the app piece. Nonetheless, there are some that make it through for whatever reason, and we see a pretty small number there. And again, what I want to reinforce in this is that while we're all familiar with apps because we use so many of them in our personal lives, and the average device has it's something like 50 or 60 apps on it. If you are and if we are focused on enterprise security, not on the consumer side, right, as individuals, but on enterprise and protecting the assets and information that you have in the enterprise. If you're an attacker, it's your best path to attack an enterprise is probably not through an app. Right? Think about the likelihood of say you're trying to compromise the CEO's device. You're probably not going to build. I'll use it like a basic. Like you're probably not going to build a flashlight app with some malicious code in it. Put it in an app store and hope that of the 6 million other apps out there between iOS and Android, that CEO finds that one flashlight and down. It's the return on your investment there as an attacker is pretty small. More likely, you're going to go the network route, compromise the device, put some sort of exploit on it, do a malicious profile, what have you. But nonetheless, we are seeing that there are apps that we see as part of this part of our analysis. We saw, to that point, about 30% of Android had some malicious apps installed, and not unexpectedly, iOS is quite a bit lower on that. And here's some more detail on the apps. 86% being Android, being suspicious Android, and about 15% suspicious iOS. I see a question. Let me look at this real quick before I do the summary for you guys. Question is, I don't know if you guys can see this or not when I'm looking at it, but it says, do you see geographical trends? Let me move this, I can read it. I think the question is, do we see geographical trends on the different types of attacks? If I didn't get that right, you guys can always send me an email directly. My email is michael.callahan@Imperium. There are certain regions where we see more types of attacks than others. There are certain regions where we see the origination of the attack, but sometimes those IP addresses are spoofed, so you can't be positive that it's coming from. But we do see some of that, and in fact, in the report we have a little more detail on some geographic information. The next question that I see, and then I'll wrap it up here for everyone. Are iOS devices 100% safe from any sort of attack or virus or worms or ransomware? And the answer is no, right? So as I was trying to highlight is that iOS does a really good job on the app side. And again, Google's doing a great job using our technology to find malicious apps before they get in the store. But that's not the only way that a device is attacked. So iOS devices can be attacked from the network side, could be from the device side. I talked about profiles. You get a man in the middle going with an iOS device, it doesn't know. And so you can, there's an attack path there as well. But it is clear that the likelihood of a device being compromised through an app on the iOS side is relatively low because of all the mechanisms in place to prevent that kind of thing. But remember, the users are the admin, so they can't download anything. They could jailbreak a phone and then download it, and then they're subject to some kind of attack there as well. So we have just another minute or so. Let me wrap up with some of the key findings. This is a kind of a summary of what I talked about. I won't read all of these to you guys, but it's a good way to show across the spectrum of device, network, and apps. You have multiple threats and multiple attacks being observed and or stopped. Every path is a likely path to compromise a device. I mean, ultimately, you want to compromise the device regardless of the originating path into compromising the device. But you see it across all of them. There's more likelihood that you're going to see something through the network side. On the app side, as we just talked about, there's more likelihood that you see, or less likelihood that an app from iOS makes it to a device and it's malicious. But I'll end on this point to just reinforce these are endpoints. The phones are just like a laptop or desktop, access to or contain the same information. And if you are an attacker, think about your motivation and how you're going to get the biggest return for your time investment. It's unlikely that you're going to do it on the app side when you're targeting an enterprise, right? I mean, it could be a path in, but it's probably a more efficient path in to target an enterprise and compromise an enterprise if you take one of the other paths. So there was one other question. It had to do with the Bezos attack and would we have prevented that? There's not a lot of, and there's not a lot of specific technical details on exactly what happened. But what I can say is if there was a vulnerability in an app, like in that case, it was WhatsApp, and that vulnerability was being exploited, we would have seen that. We would have seen that. We would have stopped it from happening. But I say that as speculation that it was a vulnerability in the app. Nobody really knows that for certain, that is how it happened. But it is important to remember when you get any of these apps that are on the devices, if they have vulnerabilities, there are ways to exploit those vulnerabilities and compromise the device. All right, so thank you all for joining today. This recording, the report will be available in the next 24 hours, the complete report. If you want to watch or listen to the webinar again, we'll have that posted on the site so you can look at it on demand. Thank you and have a good rest of your day.